Race Arena.
Grand Arena.
SAGA Podcast.
Hey everybody, it is Kennedy Hawk from the SAGA podcast team. Today it is tax day and I'm here to talk about aspect taxes or aspect penalties in the game Star Wars Unlimited. And let's talk about some cards that really make it worth it. So, in case you're new to Star Wars Unlimited, I wanted to go through what an aspect penalty or aspect tax is. So let's get right to it. An aspect penalty, this is one of the coolest features in Star Wars Unlimited, in my opinion. You can technically run any card in any deck. But if you do, you have to have the right aspects amongst your hero and base, or you'll have to pay a tax of 2 resources or a penalty for each aspect that you're missing. I think the technical word is aspect penalty, but a lot of times on our show we call it a tax because it feels like a tax on top of the normal cost to play that card. So let's go over a couple scenarios here just so everybody's on the same footing of understanding what that penalty is, if it's 2, if it's 4, if it's even more. Alright, so example 1. You're playing as Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith. You obviously have the aggression aspect and the villainy aspect on your villain card over here. You're running Energy Conversion Lab, very popular base with the command aspect, and you want to play the card Takedown. It has the Vigilance aspect, so that is not amongst your 3 aspects on your leader in base. So you could play this card, but it would cost you 4 plus a penalty or tax of 2 to make this a 6 cost card. Is it worth 6 resources? Maybe. Depends on the situation, depends on the deck, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's do a couple more examples of other scenarios. Here, same deck setup. I've got Villainy, Aggression, and Command amongst my aspects. And I want to play Vigilance, which has 2 Vigilance icons on it. I have to pay for each icon I'm missing. So here I would pay 4 plus 2 plus 2, 8 resources for Vigilance. Probably not worth it, paying double the cost of a card. In general, if a card is really high cost, right, a 8 cost card, a 2 resource penalty might not feel as bad as if you're playing a 1 cost card with a 2 resource penalty. At the same time, later in the game, you really need your things to be efficient to, sort of maintain the fragile game state. So it's a bit of a trade-off. You got to kind of find the right cards for your deck that could work as off aspect cards. The best part of these off aspect penalty tax cards is people never see them coming. So when you do play them, it's often a board state where your opponent did not prepare for whatever you're about to drop, and whether it's a big unit that they now have to deal with or an event that completely changes the state of the game, they weren't thinking about that, and their hand and board state was not prepared for the move you were about to do. That'll change as more and more people start running off aspect cards, but especially in this first set meta, I think that people really aren't as prepared for that as they could be. Alright, one more example here. So here we have Darth Vader with our aggression and villainy aspects. We have Energy Conversion Lab with the command aspect, and we want to play Attack Pattern Delta. Why? Not a very good card, probably wouldn't want to, but maybe someday you will. It's a 3 cost card with 2 command aspects. We do have 1 of those icons, so here we only have to play plus 2. So here we would be paying 5 resources for Attack Pattern Delta. So those are sort of all the different situations you can run into. Missing 2 icons, missing 1 icon. You could even play a heroism card in a villainy deck, and that works out. Because of this, it might seem like you have unlimited options when building a deck for SWU, and that's one of the best things about sealed play is any card you open can be a bomb, can be great in your deck. But we need to remember that that penalty can make cards really, really inefficient. In reality, the penalty of 2 resources, it's super steep. Virtually no one wants to pay 8 for Vigilance, but maybe it's playable at 6 in some decks. So today's video, I'm going to go over what cards I think exist that make me want to consider paying that aspect penalty. And the right answer, as any good engineer like myself would tell you, is it depends, right? It's going to depend on what your deck is, what your collection is, what your opponent expects to be in your deck, what your opponent's playing, and what you might sideboard in. There's all sorts of factors that could come into this. So not every card I'm going to list here might seem like a great off-aspect card for you, but in the decks that I'm going to mention playing them in, they might seem like, more winners. Okay. So we're going to go through the 4 different aspects, or the 4 different colored aspects, not heroism and villainy, and talk about some of the cards in each that I think are worth considering. Alright, so Vigilance is my first one. Vigilance is a 4-cost card. It's one of those double aspect icon cards. Choose 2, discard 6, heal 5, defeat an enemy with 3 or less, or give a shield to a unit. This card, to me, is usually worth 6 resources, especially if you're going to sideboard it and bring it in a control mirror. It can really change the game, being able to mill 6 cards from your opponent's deck. At the same time, don't sleep on this, even not in control mirrors. Right? It's great for healing damage off your base and giving, if you were running like a weird red-blue Sabine build, like just a little bit extra time in an aggro matchup. Shielding your units so they can't get wiped out, defeating an enemy unit and healing can really swing the point in the game. 6 is a steep cost, so not going to fit into every deck, but I think typically if you're running Vigilance, you can find a spot to fit this in your deck, even without running double Vigilance icons. Okay, our next card is It Binds All Things. At the bottom, I'm going to say typically not worth it if this is something I've tried, but I found not to be always worth it. This can be really strong if you're running a red force unit deck. If you're doing that without blue, you're missing out on a lot of force synergy. But at the same time, if you're running like Grand Inquisitor with green so you can ramp faster, this could still really be useful for like healing your Grand Inquisitor and keeping him in play for longer. This basically turns into like a 1 less damage, 1 resource more costing open fire, but you also get to heal your unit. Not great, not perfect for every situation, typically not worth it, but something to consider. Regional Governor. I think the best play with Regional Governor is blocking someone's first turn play, right? Call A-Wing against Sabine, something like that. It might be worthwhile to stall an opponent, but it's not going to stick very long, right? If you're paying 4 resources for this, that means other people are playing 4 drops to contest with your 2-drop. So that'll work if you have this protected by a lot of Sentinels. Typically, it's going to buy you a 1-turn stall, which if that's what you need, more power to you. All right, Luke Skywalker. This is one of my favorites that Mr. Ben from the Saga podcast brought up in a chat with us recently. This card's really good in blue villainy, in Vigilance villainy. It's a body that costs 9 in that deck because you don't have the heroism aspect. It says restores for 9. It should say restores for 3. But it's a body that has removal attached to it, right? Avenger is a great card because it has repeatable removal. This removal can even hit leaders, which is really, really strong. It's still a pretty stable body for late game. And since if it's going to live, and since it's typically going to live because it's going to remove whatever threat would take it out, it's going to be a removal and a heal and a big body in control late game. That's like a super big win. Not going to work in other decks that don't expect to live to 9 resources, but if that's part of your game plan, this could be a sneaky move that people aren't going to anticipate and play around. All right, let's jump to the command aspect. Overwhelming Barrage. I've talked about this card before. This card is basically Super Laser Blast for 1 cheaper if you have either the villainy or command aspect. Yes, it's not going to ping through shields and it's not going to take out everything, but this card is really, really strong even at 7 resources. Consider playing this in Vader with red, with aggression and vigilance. Right, you can flip your Vader leader, pump him to 7 attack, deal 7 across the board, attack with him and deal 2, also deal 7 to a unit. That's a board wipe right there. And it's a board wipe out of color, so even better, out of color and cheaper. I think this card is almost always worth it. I run it in green heroism decks. I run it in any green deck on the villainous side, obviously because that'd be in aspect colors, but even villainy decks that don't run green, I typically run this in because it's a really strong card. All right, Command, the double aspect card here. It's equivalent to like an academy training and a resupply, so it's not too bad, right? For 6, that would be like a 2-cost card and a 3-cost card for 6 cost, but you're only spending 1 card from your hand. My opinion, though, is that it's probably not worth it, right? If you're already at 6 resources and you're willing to play command, you don't really need to ramp. So you're giving yourself less and less and less options. That being said, returning a unit from your hand to your discard pile can be super beneficial. So if there's something you need to recur, nothing is more annoying to your opponent than if they wipe a big thing off the board and then you return it to your hand. Great for bringing home 1 back, great for bringing really nasty things in the late game back, but still typically hasn't worked out in decks for me. All right, let's jump to Aggression. I really like Aggression. I think it's really close to being there, and hopefully it will be soon. But right now, I just don't think it's super worth it at 6 resources. It's like a slightly worse than an Open Fire and an Mission Prep or Get Ready. but it's still a card cheaper, right? It's more resource cost or more expensive in resource cost at 6. Typically not worth it. Could work well in a double red aggression deck, but right now I'm not really running it in red-green or red-yellow or any of those other combinations. Maybe with some ramp it might work better in red-green villainy, but haven't tried that out too much. Force Throw. This is great in a blue force unit deck. We do, on the villainy side, get a lot of force units in aggression, but in vigilance we don't. So Chirrut decks might want to run this. You could run Chirrut with command and still run this for 3. You could run this and use it in conjunction with Ezra and some blue units. Ezra come from Cunning and some blue units from Vigilance. It's a really strong card that people aren't expecting, right? When they don't see aggression within your aspects, they think, okay, they might play a Spark of Rebellion, they might do whatever, but then when you force throw something at them, it's that damage plus discard that can really catch people off guard. Great sideboard card in those force unit decks. Ruthless Raider in aggression. It's not a great closer, right? Doesn't have the stats of Luke, but does still have that ability to remove and apply pressure for your win condition when played. Can be used in a pinch at 8 if you're in like a control mirror or if you're somehow facing a control deck and you know you're going to need like large bodies later. This is still an annoying thing for your opponent to have to remove. It's going to come in, it's going to kill a dude, it's going to deal some damage. They either have to deal with it and then suffer more unit damage and a dude, or like let you smack into base. So either way, it's like a loss for your opponent. Still typically not worth it, but really close. It's like on the edge, and I'm just looking for the right deck to use that in out of aspect. Carabas, I tried this card. I would change this from typically not worth it to like super not worth it. It's okay at 4 if you're building around units that want to sustain a ton of damage. I tried using this in combination with Redemption when I was running blue-green heroism. So you bring Redemption out, suck 8 damage off your base, and then deal 9 to things. Real cute, real funny, just not efficient enough. It's just too slow. You draw it early or it always becomes a resource. So I think it needs to be a little bit better to really be a solid removal. All right, Ezra. I have tried Ezra in a ton of decks, especially decks that are using C3PO and R2, or for a cause to believe in, so you know like what's on top of your deck. Typically, they don't work out great. The only spot I found that I like this is in Thrawn. In a Thrawn deck, when you know what's on top of your deck every round, unconditionally, you don't need another card to do it, you don't need another unit on the board, Ezra can become incredibly powerful. That being said, when you're playing Ezra, you're playing him at 5 resources then, so your opponent's going to have 5 drops to deal with Ezra. So you need to surround him with bodyguards or an immense amount of exhaustion and control to really get use out of his ability. Cunning, another double aspect card. I think Cunning is totally worth it at 6. This is an extremely disruptive card. A lot of times you can like shut 3 things down, bounce a unit and exhaust 2, or you can sneak in for the 4 damage and really deal things. It provides really strong late swing games, and it can provide really, really timeful boosts right when you need it. I think it's even good at 6 with some of these leaders that deploy late. I would run this in a Palpatine deck. I would run this in a Vader deck, even at the +2 cost, just to like give myself some really big disruption on that resource turn 6. Spark of the Rebellion at 4. I think this card is still really strong. It's obviously better at 2. Don't get me wrong, but in villainy decks where you don't have a ton of discard options available to you, this can be really great for removing like a silver bullet, right? If you're stacking a bunch of upgrades on Chirrut and you know your opponent has side decked Confiscate right before you put those upgrades on Chirrut, why don't you just pull that Confiscate out of their hand? Or check and make sure it's not there. Can be super useful in those long games. Still not great at 4. It's not efficient, but it does find its way into more decks for me. Leia, I have tried out Leia, right? At 4, I'd rather run Cunning or something else. It's just too slow for the 4 resource cost. So it may have a place in sort of like a Rebel deck or a deck that's like using U-Wing to bring it out, even though it's free then, so you don't have to pay that tax. But typically this body just doesn't stick long enough to be a useful exhaustion plus body builder. I love units or bodies that are also events, and Leia is one of them, but she's just not worth it at 4 cost to me because she typically exhausts something and gets played. The next turn your opponent goes first because you've taken one of their actions away, so they typically get to claim, and then they get to kill her without really doing anything. You've delayed the attack 1 turn. Not enough for 4 resources. Another card that I think is worth it for 4 resources is No Good to Me Dead. This is an amazing card at 2. It shouldn't cost 2. It should cost at least 3 to be on curve with like the other removals or soft removals that exist in the game. If this card is played at 4, it is still super worth it, especially when it's unexpected, right? If you're running a heroism deck and all of a sudden you pop out a No Good to Me Dead and your opponent says, crud, Boba Fett is now exhausted for 2 turns. That means you get to flip your Luke into play before I get to use him and everything's going to have shields. My day is ruined. It's a really, really, really strong card. It really slows down leaders. It can slow down aggro right on those turns when Sabine is pushing for the close. You pop this off, exhaust something, lock it down for an extra turn, and buy yourself more time to deal with it. And a lot of times it can be really, really great. So that's my conclusion for tax day on aspect penalties or aspect taxes. How do you feel about this aspect penalty or tax rule? Are there other cards you would consider playing or paying the aspect tax for, and which ones in which decks? Because like I said, I really think it depends on what deck you're trying to play that card in. So thanks for submitting this topic to the Saga podcast. We got this in a Discord question, and I really appreciated it because it's one of my favorite parts of the game, so I was glad to get to make a video and share my thoughts with all of you. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and we'll see you in the arenas.